Mr. David Holmgren, good night. How are you?
Good to be joining you in Brazil. It brings back fond memories of 2007.
We have many of your hosts in 2007 helping this event to happen. They also have very fond memories. They mentioned you and Sue. Some of them sent Sue a hug. So it was a very warm welcome to this workshop about prevention, combat, and resilience against bushfires. I would like to thank you for your time, your kind gesture, all the time that you spent with us preparing for this. And I would let you just to go straight ahead if you want, so that we have more of your time dedicated to learning.
So I can share the presentation now, I think.
You should be able to.
You can see the screen of the first
Yes, we can see the screen.
presentation there. Oh,
Yes.
great. Okay, well, it's great to be able to contribute what knowledge I can about the issue of bushfire. I have made some modifications to the presentations I use to teach in online courses, which is mostly to Australians and has an Australian lens to it. But I've managed to include some pictures and, of course, will speak to what I understand to be the situations in Brazil, which, of course, like Australia, is a very large and diverse country. But hopefully what I say will be of use. Starting with the design to ameliorate the impacts of natural disasters has been an integral part of permaculture from its beginnings in the 1970s. And that's for lots of reasons. Firstly, that natural disasters are major triggers for the loss of resilience and self-reliance, affecting both built and biological systems. And that long-lived perennial food systems, such as food forests, are assets that require more careful consideration of natural disasters than annual cropping and animal grazing systems. And food forests can ameliorate the impact of some natural disasters when mature. Also, serious concerns about the vulnerability of industrial society to the impacts of resource limits and early concerns about climate change, including the possibilities of increased natural disasters. So while disasters caused by extreme weather are our prime focus, the same principles apply in preparing for, responding, and recovering from other natural and human-created disasters, ranging from pandemics to economic depression and war. So resilient systems can bounce back from disasters, but when they also reflect more gradual underlying systemic change, they can trigger collapse and or fundamental evolutionary change. So in 1974, I moved into Bill Mollison's house on the footslopes of Mount Wellington that he'd saved from the bushfires only 7 years before. Those fires killed 62, injured 900, and left 7,000 homeless in and around Hobart, a city of only 120,000 people. His experience was an important influence in bushfire-resistant design elements depicted in Permaculture 1. The 1983 Ash Wednesday fires in Victoria and South Australia made a huge impact on my engagement with this subject. After being involved in firefighting more modest fires in Tasmania, I was working with colleagues who went through all the major fires in Victoria. The Flyway House case study design for a burnt-out property in the Dandenong Ranges was published as a case study booklet and reissued after the 2009 Black Saturday fires. So just reminding ourselves that reading the landscape where we live is essential due diligence, and especially in a time of sense of increasing extreme weather. For those living in cities, natural disasters can seem remote. The surprising frequency of flash flooding affecting urban areas requires that we read the landscape wherever we live, rather than relying 100% on command and control by authorities that is no substitute for household and neighbourhood resilience. Many suburbs and even whole towns are built on floodplains. The severity of flooding appears to be increasing in Australia, at least, while insurance costs are rising rapidly, leading to vulnerable houses becoming uninsurable. Highly valued beachfront locations have always been vulnerable and dependent on reinforcement at public expense. If sea level rises, these places become uninhabitable at any cost, as graphically illustrated in Linda Woodrow's novel set in northern New South Wales in the near future. Deep absorbent soils over clays can move en masse during extreme events, even with good forest cover. And the telltale signs of past landslips suggest these are not sites to build houses. Recent fires, floods and associated disasters in northern New South Wales reflect many of the elements in the novel 470. While current Australian building codes in tropical areas provide very good protection for all but the worst sites in the worst cyclones, migration of cyclones further south will have much greater impact where building codes are less strict. Earthquakes are rare in Australia, but in New Zealand and most other geologically young regions with dense populations, they are the greatest threat, especially in built-up areas with multi-storey buildings. The Christchurch earthquake demonstrated that previously low-risk regions can become high-risk as tectonic plates move and stresses shift. Volcanic landscapes are generally fertile and densely populated, while lava flows constitute a spectacular threat in some locations where governments, developers and residents have chosen to ignore the risks. Ash fallout is just one of the many impacts from volcanic eruptions that can affect much larger regions. And of course, while management of the broader landscape is hotly debated, helping others in our communities to make wise decisions about where and how to live is a priority for many who can see the writing on the wall and are already getting their own houses and households in order. But regulatory controls on development in the highest risk areas in Australia is slowing, but not stopping rebuilding on some of the worst locations, where views tend to attract development, just like beachside locations are attractive. So although I am quite positive about the ability to build and defend sites against bushfire, some of the extreme ones, it makes sense not to live in those locations. In Retro Suburbia, we summarised the risks relevant to the southeastern urban and urban fringe areas of the continent, with main emphasis on bushfire because it's the most common natural disaster threat, and because bushfire resilient design is so complex, it also has the potential to radically reduce the risk and hazard compared with some other natural disasters. So I want to do the same while acknowledging that priority is not always equally relevant to people everywhere. So Australia, and especially the densely settled southeast of the continent, is one of the most severe bushfire regions on Earth. And it's not surprising that it's still one of the richest countries in the world, perhaps has the best firefighting capacity. And despite funding and action upgrading that capacity, without aware, active and resilient households, neighbourhoods and communities, escalating bushfire threat can overwhelm that expanded capacity. The thinking about many about these increased threats can be simplified into two generalised positions. During and after the fires, most people in 2019-20, the Black Summer, most people concerned about climate change, especially city folk, thought the Black Summer fires would galvanise a climate emergency response by all levels of government and the whole nation. On the other hand, many, if not most, living closer to the fire threat in rural areas thought the fires would galvanise a whole-of-nation effort to better manage the bush, often expressed in calls for more fuel reduction burning. So after another Royal Commission, which mostly suggested more top-down control, the elements of truth in both these gut-level responses hasn't really come together in a larger action plan, let alone be adopted by leaders who can galvanise the nation as its focus flits from one crisis to the next. So while Black Summer was quite benign in our region, the fires affected so many we knew. And for me, it triggered a major new essay in which I tried to distill how the truth in both these perspectives might be integrated in local communities that are facing fire, even if the wider political system remains mired in entrenched positions. So I'll touch on some of the wider land management issues as part of this presentation, which starts close to home in the house, garden, and our own behaviour, that might be useful in reducing the threat of fire while simultaneously addressing the wider climate emergency. And this essay marks the sixth major period of personal focus on bushfire resilient landscapes and communities. So the first lesson that I want to convey is that houses are the prime assets and refuges. Despite the shock of fire burning through natural environments, most of those environments, to varying degrees, but predominantly recover from fire. Buildings and assets that humans create don't spontaneously rebuild themselves. So this concentration of assets is important, but they're also the most easily defendable assets. It's much harder to try and stop fire running through the landscape in the most extreme conditions. But we can protect sites. Houses are also the best refuge in firestorms, and evacuation can fail in the largest disasters, can cascade from above the failure of organisation. And so houses should be the focus of any plan for bushfire resilience. What the science in Australia has proven time and time again is the presence of an able-bodied person is the key determining factor in whether a house burns down or not. It is between 2 and 4 times more significant than any other site factor or design feature of the house itself. So that's 200 to 400% more significant. And I'm not talking about a competent professional firefighter, an able-bodied person. as scientists described them in the 1980s, when that first very large cohort of study was done over more than 4,000 houses in the areas. So Australia is definitely the leader in the science of understanding bushfire and including how houses burn in bushfires. So the Flywire House and Joan Webster's references, combined with now Bell ratings and building standards, are all useful considerations in this subject. But once we move out of the cool temperate south of the Australian continent, where it makes sense from a thermal point of view to have a house which is relatively well sealed and enclosed, which aligns with bushfire resistant design. In the subtropics and tropics, the open house structure is unfortunately more of a conflict with strong bushfire resilient design. So these photos that Rico has sent me are, of course, typical of more owner-built small constructions in rural Brazil, more open structure, because while houses like this can still provide a refuge to protect people from radiant heat, which is what is dangerous to people in a fire, but the buildings themselves are very vulnerable to ember infiltration. And it is ember infiltration which destroys buildings, the vast majority. So this is sort of like a little bit of a downside. And when I was in Brazil at Botucatu, I saw a whole lineage of experimental architecture ranging from buildings which by chance would have quite good fire resistance to ones that obviously by their nature are perhaps more flammable than the forest natural vegetation. Obviously, thatch roofs and similar construction materials are extremely vulnerable, even though they represent sustainable traditional forms. So one comment I would make is that my understanding of the fires in the savanna country in Brazil is that they appear to be more like fires that occur in northern Australia, which compared with the southern Australia, those fires are much more manageable, much less extreme, partly because of air humidity, partly because of the wind regimes, and partly because of the nature of the vegetation itself. And so the possibility that houses which don't comply with the much more extreme design requirements of southern Australia and other Mediterranean climate regions can still be defendable places in fires that occur in the savanna country. So the second important aspect is irrigated food gardens as fire-resistant buffers immediately around those defendable houses. So irrigated food gardens are the most valuable and easily defended landscapes, and they reinforce that defense of the house and the economic resilience of the household following disasters. And they really should be established around every house. So houses should be sited where productive food gardens are possible. This is sort of permaculture zoning idea. Broad-scale, unirrigated farm and forest landscapes. the protection from fire is more difficult because of scale, flammable vegetation, and the lower asset value, which is distributed over such large territory. So vegetation and fuel management
Não pode.
to minimize damage and assist fire control are the best that can be expected. And the threats from those wider landscapes to well-maintained houses and gardens are often overstated. This is a constant psychological problem in Australia where the threat is perceived to be nature out there, whereas the problem is the failure to design, manage, organise, and actively defend those small spaces. So this photo was in the permaculture calendar from 2021. And the caption that went with it was, despite the drought conditions, this 40-year-old mulberry tree had been deeply watered in the months before the fire went through in December 2019 and was on the fire side of the house. This tree, in combination with cleared space, well-sealed and strong construction, appeared to be what saved the house. Brett and Wendy are now installing water harvesting structures aiming to increase soil absorption and reduce the flammability of the forest. I actually wrote an essay about that mulberry tree, trying to nuance this idea in permaculture of fire retardant plants. Because, of course, this was one of the ideas that was put forward in Permaculture 1, published in 1978, that we don't just need to reduce fuel, that vegetation can be an asset as well as a problem. Now, I've always been also trying not to overstate this case, that just by planting some plants of a particular nature, one gives automatic protection. So in Southern Australia, this is sort of a list of species that have been shown in time to be, if not fire retardant, that they are less hazardous. And of course, in Australia, most of our native species are hazardous, but some are less so. And while this list will not be relevant to most people in Brazil, I'm sure equivalent lists can be generated because the characteristics of plants which are less flammable are well understood characteristics. They are plants with large leaves rather than very fine leaves. They are plants with low levels of flammable oils and resins and other flammable chemicals, which are mostly associated with plants evolved on infertile lands. They are plants with smooth rather than rough, fibrous or ribbon bark, and several other characteristics which can be relatively easily identified and certainly confirmed by actually experimentation. But there's definitely a fine print, and this fine print or provisos are relevant, I think, for any lists that would similarly developed for regions in Brazil. So that's a partial list that I've been recommending on residential, rural, residential and small farm properties in the mid to high rainfall areas of Southern Australia. And that all these species are useful in providing yields and or environmental service functions on permaculture design properties. and that many of the hardiest and therefore the most useful species naturalize in some environments. And the planting of a few may even be controlled by regulation, that they are effectively regarded as what's called environmental weeds. And many naturalized species that are regarded as hazardous are much less hazardous when appropriately managed, like many native species. So the issue of plant management, its age, stage of life, are all critically important in whether those plants are a hazard or a benefit. And performance in helping reduce the risk of spread of fire and retarding the impact of bushfire on buildings, livestock and people will depend on many factors, including, is the species hardy in the local soils and rainfall, or is it suited to minerally rebalanced soils and reliable irrigation conditions? In other words, is it a plant that can work in the extent landscape under the range and stresses of that climate? Or is it suitable for those inner zones of permaculture systems where soil fertility can be enhanced and extra water can be provided as irrigation? And the appropriate management to reduce dead leaves, branches, etc., the culling of sick and declining plants, and appropriate design and spacing of plants in shelter belts and or plantations. And fuel reduction of litter, whether that's by composting or livestock and or fuel reduction burning. So when we focus beyond the house in a rural landscape and talk about existing settlements, again, in the Australian context, it's these small settlements close to forest where the greatest damage occurs in the very largest fires. And this is Hepburn Springs, where Meliodora is, viewed from the northwest primary fire sector. So many fire experts concur that after making our home spaces and households more resilient, the focus on the bushland-urban interface and many small towns and settlements in bushfire-prone landscapes could radically reduce the loss of property and life in Australia, even if controlling destructive wildfires in the broader landscape remains problematic. So this start at the backdoor strategy is a perfect example of the permaculture design tool of zoning, where we concentrate our efforts close to home, where we have more to defend and where we have more control. And in the process, we might learn by baby steps how to manage our wider and wilder landscapes beyond settlement that much smaller populations of Indigenous people manage to do so without the aid of fossil fuel technology or massive organisational complexity, which is something I will come to in a minute. But this idea of permaculture site zoning around a homestead is, of course, just a conceptual framework. It's not a physical design, but that in the Australian context, often these beyond an immediate house garden, these zone 2, zone 3 landscapes are often missing. They're not there at all. They're straight to an interface with the bush, with forest. And that this zone 4, which should be managed rangelands, forests and wetlands, being managed natural systems, are mostly in the Australian context, and I think similar in Brazil increasingly, unmanaged landscapes. So this creates a greater structural problem. So, of course, Australia was the oldest continuously managed cultural landscape in the world. Strong archaeological evidence for that now. And the early paintings show landscapes which are completely different to what people imagine as the thick, continuous forest. So, of course, fire has also been an intrinsic part of the Australian landscape going back many tens of millions of years because of the unreliable climate and infertile soils that result from geological antiquity. So it's interesting that once settler colonists occupied the land, many of their practices also helped control bushfires, even though there was a huge explosion of uncontrolled fire as Indigenous land management collapsed. And so those traditional settler land uses of grazing and forestry have also declined over very large areas of country and been replaced by residential, recreational and conservation land uses in recent decades that have increased our vulnerability to fire. And then maybe we have also experienced even greater destruction due to accelerating climate change, but certainly because of change in land use. So, fuel reduction burning is currently the default land management tool in reducing fire danger in Australia's forests and protecting adjacent settlements. And this is effective in moderate fire conditions, so that following fuel reduction burning for some years in Australian forests, there is a less chance of extreme fire, but there is the ability to fight fires that are more moderate. There's not much evidence that you can still actually fight and stop very, very serious fires as a result of fuel reduction burning. But the season for safe fuel reduction burning appears to be contracting due to climate change, while the frequency and intensity of drought and extreme weather events is increasing, perhaps due to climate change. And close to settlement, the smoke problem risks to private property have driven land managers to meet their quotas to burn forest by doing it so remote from settlements and in ways that contradict ecological and cultural burning practices. You can see in that photo of myself, I'm looking very disgruntled because that is an excessively hot fire, even in our eucalypt adapted ecosystems. There's a typical fuel reduction burn fire releasing about 1,000 kilowatts per metre of fire front. You can see the rate of spread there and the height of the flames. And that sort of fire, and the one in the previous photo, leads to loss of soil carbon and nutrients, damage to trees and habitat, new fuel from fallen dry leaves, and also all the epicormic shoots that grow in response. There's the epicormic shoots that's springing out from the fire-adapted eucalypts. And this can happen in many species that have some evolutionary adaptation to fire, or even other forms of stress that result in the canopy being killed and trees re-sprout. And then when the canopy comes back, all of those re-sprouts on the trunk generally die due to shade, and that creates more fuel. We also get dense growth of eucalypts in response to fire. And so in general, I believe fuel reduction burning should be focused in forests in certain parts on dry ridges and sun and wind-facing slopes, while protecting moister slopes and stream courses. So more frequent on the same sites rather than spread over the whole landscape. And that we should also be thinning forests, especially on the south and east slopes and gullies, to reduce ground fire risk and improve ecological and timber values. So there's a revival in Indigenous cultural practices, especially in Northern Australia, and that this is not a traditional cultural burn. It's actually a fuel reduction burn, but that is more like what Aboriginal burning in the landscape was like. And in these sort of fires, it's possible to remove litter without burning the underlying compost on the soil, especially when there is residual moisture in that compost, but the litter at the top is dry. And so certainly in the Australian context and in many other fire-prone landscapes, including California, there's evidence that Indigenous land managers managed and maintained these landscapes quite effectively with these practices. But recreating that knowledge base and let alone actually implementing this on any sort of scale, in the Australian context, we are just at the very early stages of that. I want to point to other aspects of fuel reduction that are important. Rearrangement of fuel is as important as fuel reduction. And that can be with hand tools right through to machines. So most land managers think of fuel reduction mostly by burning. So what is the best example of fuel rearrangement? In Australia, it's a legal requirement with grassland fuels to close to urban areas to either graze them with animals or slash them with a machine. Now, if you are slashing them with a machine, you have not taken any fuel away. You have immediately changed it from being vertical to laying flat. And I like to use the example of think of the difference between how a book burns in a fire and if all those pages are torn out and crumpled. The same amount of fuel behaves completely differently. And so it is in bushfire, because the fire that burns in a bushfire is smaller than one's little finger. The large fuel may catch a light and burn later, but a travelling fire front that is a threat to firefighters, a threat to buildings, a threat to people and other assets and animals, is burning all of the fine fuels. And because of the intensity of that burn, of how fast it is, it can be very serious. To the extent that grass fires can be very fast moving and very hot for a very short time. And so in some circumstances can be as dangerous as forest fires. I think the greater use of grazing animals to consume and trample fuels in farming systems and use of native pasture species, fire retardant shelter belts, and silvopastoral systems to build soil and water holding capacity. So grazing livestock have been a traditional way to consume and rearrange fuel and provide ethical milk, meat, and other yields, as well as companionship and increase interest, attracting children and adults to join the animals in the, if you like, the outside gymnasium of managing one's immediate landscape. These are Sue's goats down the gully from us on the public land, eating and trampling the blackberries. I'm particularly mention goats because they are, more than sheep and cattle, browsers of tree and shrub fuels. And even though they can have devastating impacts on young trees that we actually want to protect, they are the most efficient animal in reducing a lot of those mid-level fuels between the ground fuel and the living tree canopy. They also are very water phobic. So unlike cattle, they don't damage wetlands and stream courses and other places that might be sensitive environments that we don't want damaged, because they're so water phobic, they will keep away from those areas. So I think we also need to mention earthworks to rehydrate landscapes. Keyline in pastoral farming landscapes, natural sequence farming on floodplains, especially along watercourses that are receiving storm water. These are large-scale Australian models that haven't been implemented very widespread, but show this capacity of to hold more water in the landscape. So leaky weirs and other earthworks at modest scale can emulate some of these wider landscape management strategies to slow, spread and sink water, including urban stormwater runoff, to sustain low fire hazard forests and wetlands that act as a hedge against a drying climate and a buffer against fire. There are soil amendments that can help in accelerating decomposition, ranging from biochar to fungal inoculants, and simply elevating the fertility with added calcium and phosphorus can encourage organic matter to actually cycle back more to humus. Of course, in moister tropical and subtropical climates, this recycle is not as severe a limitation as we have in Mediterranean climates. And another theme I want to mention is the protection and extension of fire retardant novel ecosystems. Now, this is in an Australian context where most of our native vegetation in the south of the continent is fire prone. But along our stream courses, novel ecosystems of low fire hazard water and nutrient holding vegetation has the potential to replace fire hazardous grasses and pioneer woody species along our peri-urban waterways. But the authorities treat these as invasive species and remove them, which is one of the bizarre contradictions we have in this country. Whereas what I see in Brazil is a lot of the native vegetation in those same stream course environments are by their nature more of what we would call rainforest vegetation, even if they are actually quite drought hardy species. And merely allowing those areas along stream courses to come to ecological maturity can provide a buffer against the spread of fire, so long as in the larger landscape on drier and poorer soils, there is work to thin forest, graze animals, and open the forest environments up to reduce the spread of fire when fire will inevitably occur. So this theme of thinning native forests also similarly applies to plantations. This is us thinning box eucalypt coppice forest for firewood and posts at the Fryers Forest Eco Village. And I included a couple of photos I took of the notorious eucalyptus from Australia in the southeast of Brazil, and showing a fire that's ravaged through a short rotation eucalypt paper pulp plantations. These are not just high risk because of the well-known characteristic of eucalyptus to burn, but they are dense, rapidly growing, unthinned forests. These are the last sort of forests we want. They are low value, low ecological value. But on the other hand, that shelter belt of eucalypts in that landscape are relatively low fire hazard, larger trees and more limited in the landscape. Similarly, these two photos I took, the one at the left in the southeast of Brazil of eucalypt and araucaria. I believe thinned forests of that type, which are actually a novel ecosystem that is emerging in southeast Brazil, have the potential to be not just magnificent forests, but also by thinning, they can be relatively low fire risk forests. This unthinned 20-year-old trial plantation at the Brasilia Botanic Gardens in the Savannah is more typical of the opportunities to radically thin plantations and allow the native lower fire hazard species to form an understory from under very widely spaced eucalyptus, rather than this idea that inherently the eucalypts are just something which is making the landscape far worse. So it's a matter of actively managing vegetation, whatever it is, and creating new livelihoods in ecological forestry. So my response to this blind spot in thinning our regrowth forests has been point to the situation in Europe, where a combination of combined heat and power systems from forest biomass are growing from an already large base at the same time that the area under forest, and in some countries even the average age of forest trees, is increasing. So this dispatchable nature of wood energy has the potential to accelerate the moves to 100% renewable grid. And in my essay, I explore how small-scale community-owned and managed biomass energy systems from local forests could allow us to put our toe in the water of biomass energy in the same way that rooftop solar has to allow us to own and manage photovoltaics. So the big difference is that we get ecologically and economically more valuable forests to hand on to future generations, and can build and operate the technology through companies and communities without undue dependence on multinational dominated global supply chains, and that we can create biochar and other products that also help further sequester carbon. So in Australia, thinning our forests are perhaps the best chance of also saving our wetter eucalypt forests from progressive desiccation, frequent fire cycles, and an ecological drift to drier and more infertility-tolerant trees and shrubs. So in Australia, many conservationists persist with a terra nullius notion in the face of climate change, and this is very frustrating. But I see many parallels, even though the context in Brazil is quite different. I think there are some areas where new livelihoods from ecological forestry in Brazil are ahead of us, and it's possibly in the use, because eucalyptus is not regarded as a part of nature and is just a a plantation species. The creative uses I saw of round pole timbers suggest that this is that Brazil is a leader in this way of how can we use wood more effectively instead of concrete and steel and aluminium and industrial materials, because both in Australia and Brazil could be the Swedens of the Southern Hemisphere in terms of our use of wood as a sustainable construction material and also for biomass energy. And so this connection between this fire in the landscape, the need to manage forests, and the opportunities that come from it. So biomass energy is on the move in multiple forms, and some with better ecological and social credentials than others. And this with gasifier technology from All Power Labs in California is just one of the myriad of small-scale manufacturers in this space. And you can see by my scorecard added to their graphic, giving a permaculture fail to using grain or even acorns as a biomass feedstock, but a big tick to using nature's greatest and most easily renewable resource of trees. And again, this needs to be done at the small and the local scale to avoid the problems of the industrial scale. I want to just quickly finish up with a few photos of Meliadora at the edge of Hepburn Springs and the management of this commons area to the north of us, because we have been involved in managing this area informally, along with other members of the community, which is sort of a permaculture-inspired version of what in Australia is called land care, but without all the paperwork and the funding and, dare I say, the poisons that are used in many land care projects. And so Vern Howe was the fourth generation local, working to reclaim the commons after decades of abandonment. And it built on the lineage through the first half of the 20th century when self-reliant locals used the gullies left barren by gold mining as a common for ranging their house cows, collecting firewood, trapping rabbits, and collecting blackberries. And after decades of abandonment to blackberry gorse and Cape broom, then willow and other deciduous trees were beginning to shade out these pioneer plants and create more human-friendly, fire-safe and stormwater purifying canopy. So our aims have been to accelerate and diversify this natural succession process. And our strategy's mostly been track making, releasing of trees or regenerating and replanting where we could. And we had fun enjoying what nature was creating faster than we could. This increased our commitment to studying these novel ecosystems. And we documented and communicated to others on tours, courses, and the web the extraordinary ecological and community services of these novel ecosystems. Dr. Michael Wilson, Australia's foremost expert on willow ecology, was part of our crew when he did his PhD on willow ecology in Spring Creek. He's since supervised half a dozen more PhDs that confirm our observations of these remarkable trees over more than 3 decades. But we've also defended the area from destruction disguised as land care by governments and catchment authorities that continue to ignore the science. And we experienced the power and beauty of super wet season floods without damage on creeks, the damage that happened on creeks where the willows had been destroyed. And then we've now lived and worked through a fire emergency where Spring Creek was the front line in a massive exercise of state and volunteer resources to defend Hepburn from bushfire. So that fire was stopped at the edge of the creek corridor. And I think we're incredibly grateful that the full force of technological firepower, the good luck of benign weather, and the modest resilience already demonstrated by novel nature was the factors. So there's lots of lessons to digest from that experience to further empower informal occupation and management of the commons. But I also want to celebrate stories of resilience of people and communities that have survived fire, and to understand that the deep learnings from the survivors is that sometimes the authorities' management of the communities after the disaster can be as traumatic as the disaster itself. But I believe that we could solve what we call the greeny redneck divide in our own communities with practical solutions that bring together the best from both sides. And that we need to end the blame game and discard failed ideologies. So there are some resources from the Holmgren website. There, some of which are downloadable free, some of which are things we have for sale, including Joan Webster's books, the greatest bushfire educator in Australia, who lived in our community and died earlier this year in her 90s. Thank you. So that's the end of the presentation.
David, thank you very much. Just to align with you, how much time you're thinking about having a Q&A?
Well, we can allow at least half an hour.
Thank you. I'll ask Victor to collect some of the questions. If you guys have some questions, I would prefer to make it even more interesting, because we have some permaculture educators and activists, and we also have some firefighters. So I would prefer to have these questions first. And in order to allow time for the team to organize, I will make some of my questions ahead. David, you talk a lot about the greeny redneck divide. Brazil lives perhaps one of its worst epoch in terms of political divide. I'm of the opinion that people belonging to ideologies instead of territories is one of the greatest problems we have, because if we belong to a territory, you will be way more willing to make bridges rather than to point fingers. You touched on that on the presentation, but how, in a more practical way, or perhaps your story with your friends, and how have you been bridging these gaps in the past decades? If you could
Yes, well,
comment on that, please.
I think the first, in coming here in the mid-80s, we were very low-key about what we were doing, rather than very high profile about permaculture and permaculture ideology. And that was in a community that was very diverse. It had this long history of rural battler, people who were timber workers, people who were gold miners, and small rural manufacturing and agriculture, as well as having a history as a tourist town. And then from the 1970s on, one of the centres in Victoria where the Back to the Land movement and alternative people had gathered. So we had this very diverse community, and in
An unintentional one.
yes. So we're living in a small town and on the fringe of that town. So the partnership with the man that was in the photo, Vern Howe, sort of came about through common interest in re-establishing some sort of management. And I found his ideas when I first met him came clearly from observation of the environment rather than some ideological projection. And not just that it wasn't ideologies from my side of the fence, because if he could be described as a right-wing, rural, libertarian redneck, I could have been described as an ex-urban, university-educated, left-wing greenie. But we found that we had this common interest in trees, and we worked together informally doing things in the public land. And it was his multi-generational knowledge that this land had been effectively a common, which is an idea that we have lost in Australia from the English tradition of what we would call public land, or in Australia it's called Crown land, owned by the state, which is effectively managed for common benefit informally by the community. And so he had experience and knowledge of those elements that continued until about the 1960s, when affluence arrived and people got rid of their house cows and bought dairy products from the shop, got rid of their wood stoves and got oil heaters, and stopped trapping rabbits, so that these areas were abandoned and grown over. Now, there were very interesting results from that, because under the commons management there'd never been soil rebuilding after the devastation of the gold era. So it wasn't like weren't benefits from this abandonment of land, but we were going back in and starting to manage this again. And I remember when Vern Howe asked me, "What's this permaculture stuff about, Dave?" Because he'd heard of my association with this idea. And I said, "Don't worry about it, Vern. It's just what you and I do down the gully on the weekend." So I was even, now later on, we had him involved in teaching on showing things in the environment on our permaculture design courses in the 90s. And he's featured in the film Reading Landscape with David Holmgren. So we found that there were certain issues that we tended to argue intensively about, but in things that we could relate to in our environment, we had more and more commonalities. And I think I can say that he influenced me over the decades and I influenced him. So that's a sort of like a microcosm of what you're saying about geographic community rather than network community. And I think it's important to acknowledge that permaculture has spread around the world as a network community, but its ideology is about localism and being grounded back in geographic community. So I think understanding also that there are many insights and understandings from all sorts of perspectives, even if some of those aspects we can agree to disagree. What's important is about what we can agree to work on, which is of common interest. And in Australia, safety from fire is actually something that brings people together at a practical level, at least, for most people.
Well, in Brazil, the risk of economic collapse and the abandonment of government, of its citizens and its constituencies, it should be enough for people to build bridges as well. And there you have it. You have David Holmgren promoting a non-accredited permaculture NEC teacher to a permaculture course. I'm just joking because we need to value connections and land-based knowledge. I have a comment with a question, and I'll try and bring Sergio Pamplona here because he's got a question that's related to my comment and question. I think you can bundle them together. You also gave us an example when you say that you started doing this management of the creek as a sort of a deviant or not necessarily allowed by the council. So in a gray area, let's put it like that. Most riparian zones in Brazil are protected by law. Most forests that we would call maybe zone 4 and 5 are also protected by law. And some of our parks are actually burning because we cannot manage them. So that goes combined with a very biased and ignorant view of grazing animals when they're properly managed. But I'll bring Sergio to ask his question, which is related to zones.
Hello, Sergio.
Hi, David. How are you?
Good.
Good. Just a question about zoning in permaculture, because you said about those areas that you introduce grazing animals to reduce fuels, and like the gullies right by Meliodora. Do you consider that a zone 4 or it's a zone 5? Just to check, because
Yeah,
as far as I understand, if you put animals and if you do something, it's not a zone 5 anymore. Is that so?
absolutely. I regard Zone 5 as an ecological reference area where we don't impose any management perspective, even an area which is a designated special flora reserve where we may remove non-native species is not, in my view, a Zone 5 because we are still imposing some management. So a Zone 5 is actually a really quite special area in that it's an ecological reference point where we study and look at things, but we don't intervene. And
Yeah,
so I
that's
think
how I
that's a
understand.
small part of any landscape, but the vast majority of most landscapes is a managed wild. So by that, I see that most of the plants are self-established, and that can range from grasslands through to dense forests, and where we may intervene and graze animals, harvest material, but the cycles of ecological replacement are largely natural processes. So I distinguish that from plantations and forests that we specifically plant and maybe manipulate the soil mineral fertility, let alone adding irrigation water to change the climate, that those are effectively Zone 3 systems, whether they are forests or whether they are pastures where there are sown species. And obviously there's a gradient between that. And down the gully system, the areas close to Meliodora, a lot of the trees are actually now planted trees. And so it's almost like has elements of, we would say, Zone 3. But the vast majority of it is really where we are making tracks and thinning things and occasionally using animals, but it's more natural processes are the predominant action in a Zone 4.
Thanks. Great.
David, perhaps I'll invite Marcelo. We have another permaculture teacher here that wants to make a question, but perhaps I'll oppose the zones. in terms of asking questions. Most people involved with successional agroforestry systems in Brazil, they are bringing the forests with the use of eucalyptus and other exotic trees to zones 1 and 2. And the argument is that they know how to manage. But in the semi-arid and in the Brazilian savannas, Cerrado, we have people covering soils with 25, 30 centimeters of soil cover, sometimes or very frequently using eucalyptus to thinnings to cover soil. And that becomes a hazard. How do you approach that?
Well, I think as you move to drier and more infertile landscapes and landscapes with very strong seasonal variation, because this is the essential characteristic of the Mediterranean climate, where you have a lot of growth of biomass in the rainy season, and then a very extended dry season where there's a desiccation rather than a decomposition. So that's where it becomes essential to firstly try and preference where one is using fast-growing woody biomass. And I understand there's lots of climatic and microclimate reasons in the tropics and subtropics to actually have big, large biomass around houses, shading houses. But one aspect that we can learn from Japanese culture is that the management of biomass in that sort of environment to allow air movement through, so you have better evaporative cooling, that the environment is actually open underneath, even if there is large shading trees, and that where possible, those large shading trees are, if not food producing, they're dense, low fire hazard canopies rather than things like eucalyptus. So of course, eucalyptus and fast-growing leguminous trees can all be used to sort of power up a biomass system, but it's very easy for the power of those large forest trees to get away from management and not to be turned back into compost, but doing that at the right time of the year, at the start of the wet season is essential. So here at Meliadora, we do the small-scale forestry work around the property in the autumn period, because that's the start of our rainy season. And so we get that decomposition, and then we use techniques, not necessarily just chipping, but that technique that I showed in the photo of chainsawing through debris to lower the height of it and take the air out of it and accelerate the rates of decomposition. So there are many techniques that can be used in those.
Pardon me, Dave. You have mentioned before as well that in doing this technique, when you have leguminous trees, it accelerates the rate of decomposition.
Yes. So that where possible, it's better to use leguminous, low fire hazard, fast biomass trees if that's the function that you have in the system, rather than hazardous species like eucalyptus, which are really better in the outer zones as large, big structural timber trees in drier landscapes where there's grazed separation from other forest fuels.
Another problem that we have is that we have many African grasses in our savanna, and as you pointed out very well, they desiccate instead of decompose. So vast areas of Brazil are burning not because of the use of animals, but because of the inappropriate use of animals and not harvesting those grasses in the right time as well. Can you comment on the role of animals more a bit further from what you already done in the presentation,
Yeah.
please?
I suppose there's a complex thing here because, of course, set stocking of animals and overgrazing tends to eat out the palatable grasses and preference the unpalatable grasses, which then become fuel. So that there's situations where, as a result of grazing, there can be a drift to more and more unpalatable and flammable grasses, which then animals don't eat. Obviously, different animals, have different preferences and abilities to absorb. And when we get to those larger landscapes, in some places, machine slashing is an option. In other places, the landscape is too rugged or difficult and not suitable. But trying to rebalance the grazing regimes by having large numbers of animals on a small area for a short time and then moving those animals. And whether that's with electric fencing or whether it's with shepherding, this rotational grazing is a universal principle across grasslands from the dry subtropics and tropics right through to the Mediterranean, so that larger numbers of animals in a smaller space for a shorter time has multiple benefits. Animals tend to eat more, and then the grasses are allowed to recover. And also the hooves on the ground flatten a lot and add nutrients to that and encourage decomposition. So where that is being done in relatively infertile areas, then sometimes supplementary feeding with beneficial hay grasses or extra nutrition can sustain the livestock and bring back the fertility into that patch and support the more palatable grasses. So there's a lot of understanding in the regenerative agricultural networks in the United States, in Australia, and many other countries to sort of make better use of grazing animals. So rather than grazing animals just being wandering randomly in the landscape.
Yeah, Charles Marcy's book, The Call of the Red Warbler, he mentions 144,000 liters per hectare for each 1% of carbon increase in soil. So that can be done with animals as well, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. The animal management is one of the big tools we have in the landscape, and it's obviously fire and grazing animals were the two tools that our ancestors had, because once we go beyond that and beyond the scale that we can manage in garden farming, then we're talking about basically fossil fuel, toxins, machines, those other tools. So the better understanding of grazing animals and fire are, I think, the two tools that, and both are clearly can damage the environment. They are powerful tools, and they need to be used carefully.
We have a question from Marcelo about Zone 5 in semi-arid areas, and I'll just squeeze another one of mine with his, which is, would you still use animals in Zone 5? Marcelo, can you come in, please?
Yeah, so I would see that animals are part of all
David,
ecosystems.
Sorry to interrupt you. Marcelo asked me to extend the question here instead of having him asking you. So he's saying that in recent studies, different biomes in Brazil, mainly the semi-arid northeast part of Brazil, the permaculture design eventually may begin with zone 5. And his argument or comment, I'm not sure, it's because that it would help to accumulate water in the landscape. And that can be done before other areas. So he's saying many parts.
This is,
yeah, you go.
in my interpretation, these are zone 4 landscapes. These are managed wild landscapes, and that I can understand the perspective that you look at some landscapes and you say there is erosion happening, there is at the larger scale, and we need to start in that larger scale landscape to intervene to, if you like, stop the bleeding of the landscape, which is different from the strategy of, okay, where do we live? Where are we locating? How do we start at the back doorstep? And so I know there is a case, and it can be made for, in some landscapes and some contexts, to start with the larger landscape. But that is what I define as a zone 4, not a zone 5, because zone 5 is a limited area. It's not an extensive area. It's an area where we only study. So that means we have some protection against whatever we are projecting into the landscape as a solution. But there's still another, it's your scientific experiment where you have a control. That's it. It's a control.
Thank you. He goes further. He asks, what pathways would you suggest to accumulate more water in the landscape, and consequently to raise or to diminish fire hazards?
Well, I think that involves sometimes two different strategies. If you look at the essence of Yeomans' keyline strategy was to start at the ridges and the top of the landscape and how to get water to soak into those landscapes. And then Peter Andrews with natural sequence farming was to start with the stream courses or intermittent channel flows that had become eroded stream courses, to block those up and get that water back out on the floodplains to recharge and absorb. So one is starting at the top of the landscape and the other is starting at the bottom. And certainly I argued with Peter Andrews that his ideas were actually complementary to Yeomans, even though he was very dismissive of Yeomans' work. So I think that can happen on the small scale too, that in some places you have a water flow coming through a landscape, often with an eroded course, and with studying that, one can block that and get the water to spread out on adjacent alluvial flats. In other situations, you can be starting at the headwaters and building small leaky weirs that only catch and absorb water when there's very substantial flows in the landscape. But that can be part of normal forest management activities where you're using the surplus woody biomass that needs to be thinned to create contour swale structures that are actually just debris structures. So that's a step before going, oh, we can intervene in the landscape by digging structures like swales, and that can happen on a very small scale by hand when the soils are wet and when there's moisture in the land. And then the next level up is, of course, intervening with machinery to do things like that. And so those larger scale interventions need to be informed by knowledge and experience in the landscape that are best built from the small experiments. Similarly, like when you're intervening on a stream course, we have done that on a catchment with 40 hectare catchment, but then we have another stream that's joining that has a 300 hectare catchment. And we know that intervening on that scale is way more complex. And we're mostly doing just assisting what nature is already doing in that scale. So again, start with the small, learning from those cycles, and then gradually being able to build where there are the resources and the technical knowledge to experiment with things that inevitably may involve larger risks.
I've done one that was, the site was maybe fit for a larger one, so but I didn't have enough clay, so I did a small, a leaky one in the Brazilian Cerrado. And in about 2 years now, instead of having this course, which is intermittent, only flowing during the rainy season, now we have it extended 4 months into the dry season. Even if it's a leaky one, it's still working. David, we are heading. Sorry, you go.
I was just going to mention I don't know whether it's included in the Tropical Handbook from Timor, which is a fantastic resource for permaculture, the Permaculture Tropical Handbook. But the activists there have told me about programs to building leaky weirs that have actually protected the city of Dili from massive flooding. And they said that the actual pattern of what they are following is a water buffalo wallow that they create and this is a sort of dry tropics environment in Timor, very similar to a lot of Brazil, and that they've now had quite a lot of experience in that, and it's big programs that are done by school groups and supported by the government, using these leaky weir structures down these steep catchments to slow and spread the water. So that would be very interesting to follow up on those.
Another advantage of those is that you can do them by like a working bee or lots of people by hand. Yeah. David, I suppose we are heading to an end. I would like to make another question if nobody else has questions for you. You mentioned the difficulty of designing houses in terms of they have gaps, they are open. And I would like to comment on that in the sense that our weather is going crazy. We're likely having more bushfires every year now. And so in some areas in Brazil, how would you go about the designing of this or the retrofit of these houses? Because I suppose they need to be closed.
Yes, well, I think it's a complex balance, I think, is to sort of try and do an audit of where are the greatest risks in a building. And sometimes that can be things like enclosure of the underfloor space that may have been used as storage areas and have a lot of flammable materials. And can that be enclosed not to eliminate air movement, but with mesh like steel fly wire mesh that can actually stop embers coming in under a house. And that was one of the features in the project we did, the fly wire house, recognizing that fine metal mesh is a relatively low cost material that can be used to block ember entry into some places while allowing air movement, because it's that sort of like snowstorm of fine burning embers blowing in the wind that lodge in all little crevices and places that are the primary threat to buildings. Secondly, the idea of a seasonal tidy up, where, for example, you can have large veranda spaces with outdoor living that then accumulate all sorts of debris and both blown leaves and maybe just possessions and things of actually can, in the fire vulnerable season, things be tidied up and paid inside cupboards or spaces, so that some of those outdoor living environments are relatively more manageable. So a lot of these things are about the sort of normal tidiness culture, which is another, if you like, traditional sort of way of thinking about things. But I think that still means there's also things of looking at materials like that in relation to timber, for example, smooth round pole timbers rather than rough sawn timbers. Different surfaces of materials are very significant in terms of their ability to catch fire. And so, for example, with the Flywire house, we actually deliberately talked about it being a timber-sided house, but it was white weatherboard. So that painted surface is actually quite resistant to catching on fire, which is quite counterintuitive, where people think of, oh, because if a building is made of materials which are burnable, it is vulnerable. Whereas if it's made from things like masonry, it's not. It's more the contents and the detailing of buildings that are the issue. So understanding more about that, I think, can balance those things. The other thing is that well-managed fire retardant vegetation a little bit back from a house can act as an ember absorber to catch that wind field of embers, and that if those trees and shrubs are well managed and the right species and the fuel levels underneath them are low, then they can cope with receiving those embers and not start burning. And so that therefore protection of a house against wind is actually a big part of the issue of fire. The idea of a house right up on a hilltop, grassy landscape with no trees around is actually can be quite vulnerable to fire.
The king of the hill.
Yeah, because of wind. So a lot of this design is around dealing with wind.
David, we have another one here from Andre. He's asking if you can comment on the wind patterns and indigenous people's management of fire.
Yes, there's the re-establishment of understanding of how these landscapes were managed is quite complex, especially in southern Australia, where that Indigenous management was lost so long ago. In the tropics, there is some fantastic recovered knowledge. Victor Stephenson's book, Fire Country, I can highly recommend. He is a leading figure in a direct lineage from old people he learned from in the Cape York region of Queensland. But there's different views, I suppose. One is that people burnt in the landscape as soon as the landscape would burn, as often as it would burn. And that meant they were burning the same sort of areas year after year. So a dry, rocky ridge that they might be walking down in the forest, lighting the fire, and the fire would naturally go out before it got into the wetter parts. So that counterintuitively is sort of like a form of micro land degradation, but any of the smoke and ash from that is actually just fertilizing the local environment next to it, which is not burned. And so by burning the same places over and over again, they ended up differentiating the landscape into very clear different types of vegetation. And that is a sort of a definite clear pattern. The other suggestion is that in relation to wind, that people had effectively good short-term weather forecasting of knowing when the wind was going to change, whether by synchronous signs with bird or other animal behavior, that we could light the fire here and the wind would take it there and then change and burn back on itself. Because, of course, wind is the biggest, most powerful factor and unpredictable factor in firefighting. The doubling of the wind speed increases the spread of fire and the intensity of fire eightfold. So, wind is, and we know this from blowing on a fire, wind is far more powerful than temperature. And in conventional weather forecasting, it's one of the most difficult things to predict. So that's another aspect that is speculated, that people had that knowledge that they could appear to be just randomly dropping flame anywhere and walking on, but knew what would actually happen naturally in that, combined with the fact that this idea of burning the same environments and in the process keeping fire out of other types of ecosystems that didn't need that. So that differentiation of the landscape, and that then reinforces itself and makes it easier and easier to maintain that.
Yeah, I believe the rescue of this kind of knowledge, together with work from permaculture, PA almonds, and all of that, will be very useful in the future, because as we go into more severe energy descent, governments are withdrawing. Like in places like Brazil, we have the fires are just spreading, and there is no professionals to do anything.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that happened in Australia following the great 1939 fires was the self-organisation of landholders into volunteer fire brigades. And that structure still exists. As a result of the Royal Commission, there was a decision of governments to support that. What's happened in Australia now is we have these very well-resourced volunteer firefighters, but increasing bureaucracy, which is actually preventing them from actually going into areas, partly for safety reasons and whatever, and that the dysfunction of well-resourced firefighting but strangling bureaucracy is actually leading to landowners actually developing again their own autonomous, self-organised, community-based firefighting brigades. And I do want to mention that the great fires that are attributed, that happened in Australia in 2019, that were attributed to massive climate change. There was actually only 3 what are called a bad blow-up days in that summer, but a lot of the fires weren't actually fought. So whether it's due to collapse of government resources or whether it's due to a withdrawal due to risk management culture or many, many other factors, some of the things that's certainly happening in Australia is fires are being let burn in the landscape. And so that lack of management of fires and the lack of management of the landscape appear to be bigger, more clearly understandable factors than the proven effects of climate change accelerating the fire, even though both may be at work. And so these complex human factors, both behavioural right through to organisational of government, historically have been, big factors in determining how landscapes burn.
Yeah, and I suppose as well, the bureaucracy is a symptom of their tentative control why we have energy descent. Like the bureaucracy increases because they want to control the energy that is in the system.
And certainly one of the patterns that's emerging is a perception by urban-centred authorities that the countryside is not a viable place for people to live, and that whether by planning or self-organisation, the withdrawal of services and saying you are on your own, or you can relocate into the cities, and we will look after you in a tighter straitjacket. So this structural pattern,
with a small cost of digital IDs.
Yeah, so this is a pattern that I identified in my future scenarios work in the Brown tech scenario. And whether you attribute it to sort of planned intervention for greater control of society, or whether it's a self-organising pattern, it's definitely a pattern we are seeing, that progressively the system under stress says close down the periphery, withdraw services and hold the centre, and the city being the centre. So that I think that is important for people to realise that self-organisation and the lineage of those things will be more important one way or the other.
David, thank you very much. We have one question from the semi-arid. Can I squeeze the final one?
Yes, yeah, one last, and then we'll need to go.
Ayrton, would you like to ask your question? So Ayrton is from an area sort of close by to Marsha. He manages a small property in Ayrton. 3, 2, 1. I'll make the question. He's asking what are the impacts on wells with the risk of if the drying up of wells because people are irrigating semi-arid areas will increase the risk of bushfires, if I understood it correctly.
Yeah, if I understand, groundwater depletion by large-scale extraction can, for very deep tap-rooted trees, which actually not just survive through dry seasons, but actually are actively transpiring vegetation, that a receding groundwater table can have huge impact. I mean, I suppose in thinking about that, I think about those landscapes that I visited in Bahia, where the big cashew trees growing, and powering through the dry season. Obviously, their roots fed by groundwater systems that the seasonal crops grown in the wet season don't in any way access in those dry landscapes. And yeah, we didn't see big industrial scale extraction of water, but I heard that in other areas not that far from that region, there were large scale irrigation systems. So that definitely is a threat. Of course, gradual dropping of a water table, trees can actually follow that water table down in many cases. But it's a complex thing, of course, hydrology, and understanding the degree to which water extraction is working within the annual cycle of effectively a renewable, rechargeable system, or whether it is actually depleting what may amount to a fossil water resource. And that can be important. And I suppose it's always good to have in the landscape surrogate of critically important trees. I don't know whether there's a replacement that produces food like the cashew tree that has deep roots. For example, that idea of, are there other trees in the landscape that can be introduced that are that much hardier again to a drying climate? So always having that next suite of plants present in a landscape that are the tougher, more adapted to what could come. And that's part of the diversity strategy in permaculture of hedging against climate change, whatever form that comes in, of having that diversity of things that are adapted to more extreme climate regimes.
Well, Mr. Holmgren, thank you very much. It was a very inspiring presentation. You're very kind with your time and your knowledge. We have the help of many educators here, as I said. I forgot to mention Antonio Zayek. He worked with André Soares for quite some time as well. He's here with us today. So I was helped by many of your fellow members of the Permaculture Network. I would like to extend my thank you from them, and my personal one to you. You've been very kind with your time. I've been studying your material for a long time. It does help a lot to understand the energy descent and how we have to lead the way to be prepared. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you and for organising that, and it's great to be able to contribute to things a little in Brazil, and to even see some old faces that I've met before. Thank you.
Have a good day, mister. Thank you very much.